Oh, there, your imaginary friend. I have another story for you from by Clark Ashton Smith from his collection The Double Shadow and Other Fantasies. Now, as always, bear in mind that sometimes an author will have included something in their work that the time of writing seemed fine to them, and it's not always fine. This is called The Voyage of King Euvoran. The crown of the kings of Ustheim was fashioned only from the rarest materials that could be procured anywhere. The magically graven gold of its circlet had been mined from a huge meteor that fell in the southern isle of Sintram, shaking the isle from shore to shore with calamitous earthquake. And the gold was harder and brighter than any native gold of earth, and was changeable in color, from a flame-like red to the yellow of young moons. It was set with 13 jewels, every one of which was unique and without fellow, even in fable. These jewels were a wonder to behold, starring the circlet with strange, unquiet fires and fulgurations, terrible as the eyes of the cockatrice. But more wonderful than all else was the stuffed gazolba bird, which formed the superstructure of the crown, gripping the circlet with its steely claws above the wearer's brow, and towering royally with resplendent plumage of green, violet, and vermilion. Its beak was the hue of burnished brass. Its eyes were like small dark garnets in bezels of silver, and 7 lacy miniated quills arose from its ebon-dappled head, and a white tail fell down in a straightly spreading fan, like the beams of some white sun behind the circle. The Gazolba bird was the last of its kind, according to the mariners who had slain it in an almost legendary isle beyond Sotar, far to the east of Zothique. For 9 generations it had decked the crown of Ustheim, and the kings looked upon it as the sacred emblem of their fortunes and a talisman inseparable from their royalty, whose loss would be followed by grave disaster. Eovaran, the son of Carpum, was the 9th wearer of the crown. Superbly and magnificently he had worn it for 2 years and 10 months, following the death of Carpum from a surfeit of stuffed eels and jellied salamander's eggs. On all state occasions, levees and daily grantings of public audience and administrings of justice, it had graced the brow of the young king, and had conferred upon him a dreadful majesty in the eyes of the beholders. Also, it had served to conceal the lamentable increase of an early baldness. It came to pass, in the late autumn of the 3rd year of his reign, that King Euvoran rose from a goodly breakfast of 12 courses and 12 wines, and went forth, as was his custom, to the Hall of Justice, which occupied an entire wing of his palace in the city of Aramoam, looking down in several colored marble from its palmy hills to the rippled lazuli of the Orient Ocean. Being well fortified by his breakfast, Eovaran felt himself prepared to unravel the most involute skeins of legality and crime, and was likewise ready for the meting of swift punishment to all malefactors. And beside him, at the right arm of his kraken-sculptured throne of ivory, there stood an executioner, leaning on a huge mace with a leaden head that was tempered to the hardness of iron. Full often with this mace the bones of the more flagitious offenders were broken immediately, or their brains were split in the king's presence on a floor that was strewn with black sand. And beside the left arm of the throne, a professional torturer busied himself continually with the screws and pulleys of certain fearsome instruments of torture, as a warning of their fate to all evil doers. And not always idle were the turnings of these screws and the tightenings of these pulleys, and not always empty were the metal beds of the machines. Now, on that morning, the constables of the city brought before King Euvoran only a few petty thieves and suspicious vagrants, and there were no cases of felony, such as would have warranted the wielding of the mace or the use of the torture implements. So the king, who had looked forward to a pleasurable session, was somewhat balked and disappointed, and he questioned with much severity the minor culprits before him, trying to extort from each of them in turn an admission of some graver crime than that whereof he was accused. But it seemed that the pilferers were innocent of aught but pilfering, and the vagrants were guilty of naught worse than vagrancy, and Euvoran began to think that the morning would offer scant entertainment, for the bastinado was the heaviest punishment that he could legally impose on such misdemeanants. "Away with these mackerel!" he roared to the officers, and his crown shook with indignation, and the tall gazolba bird on the crown appeared to nod and bow. "Away with them, for they pollute my presence. Give each of them 100 strokes with a hardwood briar on the bare sole of each foot, and forget not the heels. Then drive them forth from our moam toward the public refuse grounds, and prod them with red-hot tridents if they linger in their crawling." Then, ere the officers could obey him, there entered the Hall of Justice 2 belated constables, hauling between them a peculiar and most unsavory individual, with the long-handled, many-pointed hooks that were used in Erimoam for the apprehending of malefactors and suspects. And though the hooks were seemingly embedded in his flesh as well as the filthy rags that served him for raiment, the prisoner bounded perpetually aloft in the manner of a goat, and his captors were obliged to follow in these lively and undignified saltations, so that the three presented the appearance of tumblers. With a final volition in which the officers were drawn through the air like the tails of a kite, the incredible personage came to a pause before Euvoran. The king regarded him in amazement, blinking rapidly, and was not prepossessed by the singular suppleness with which he louted to the very floor, upsetting the scarce recovered equilibrium of the officers, and causing them to sprawl at full length in the royal presence. "Ah, what have we now?" said the king in an ominous voice. "Sire, 'tis another vagabond," replied the breathless officers, when they had regained a more respectfully inclined position. "He would have passed through Erimoam by the main avenue in the fashion that you behold, without stopping and without even lessening the altitude of his saltations, if we had not arrested him." "Such behavior is highly suspicious," growled Euvoran hopefully. "Prisoner, declare your name, your nativity and occupation, and the infamous crimes of which, beyond doubt, you are guilty." The captive, who was cross-eyed, appeared to regard Euvoran, the royal mace-wielder, and the royal torturer, and his instruments, all in all, a single glance. He was ill-favoured to an extravagant degree. His nose, ears, and other features were all possessed of unnatural mobility, and he grimaced perpetually in a manner that caused his unclean beard to toss and curl like seaweed on a boiling whirlpool. "I have many names," he replied in an insolent voice whose pitch was peculiarly disagreeable to Euvoran, setting his teeth on edge like the grating of metal on glass. "As for my nativity and occupation, the knowledge of these, O king, would profit you little." "Sirrah, you're a malapert. Give answer, or tongues of red-hot iron shall question you," roared Euvoran. "Be it known to you, then, that I am a necromancer, and was born in the realm where the dawn and the sunset come together, and the moon is equal in brightness to the sun." "Ah, a necromancer!" snorted the king. "Know you not that necromancy is a capital crime in Estaim? Verily, we shall find means to dissuade you from the practice of some such infamies." At a sign from Euvoran, the officers drew their captive toward the instruments of torture. Much to their surprise, in view of his former ebullience, he allowed himself to be chained supinely on the iron bed that produced a remarkable elongation of the limbs of its occupants. The official engineer of these miracles began to work the levers, and the bed lengthened little by little with a surly grating, till it seemed that the prisoner's joints would be torn apart. Inch by inch was added to his stature, and though after a time he had gained more than a half cubit from the stretching, he appeared to experience no discomfort whatever. And to the stupefaction of all present, it became plain that the elasticity of his arms, legs, and body was beyond the extensibility of the rack itself, for the latter was now drawn to its limits. All were silent, viewing this prodigy. Euvoran rose from his seat and went over to the rack, as if doubtful of his own eyes that testified to a thing so enormous. And the prisoner said to him, "It were well to release me, O King Euvoran." "Say you so?" the king cried out in rage. "However, it is not thus that we deal with felons in Usthaim." And he made a private sign to the executioner, who came forward quickly, rearing his massive leaden-headed mace aloft. "On your own head be it," said the necromancer, and he rose instantly from the iron bed, breaking the bonds that held him as if they'd been chains of grass. Then, towering to a terrible height, which the wrenchings of the rack had given him, he pointed his long forefinger, dark and sere as that of a mummy, at the king's crown, and simultaneously he uttered a foreign word that was shrill and eldritch as the crying of migrant fowl that pass over towards unknown shores in the night. And lo, as if in answer to that word, there was a loud, sudden flapping of wings above Euvoran's head, and the king felt that his brow was lightened by the crown's goodly and well-accustomed weight. A shadow fell upon him, and he and all who were present beheld above them in the air the stuffed gazolba bird, which had been slain more than 200 years before by seafaring men in a remote isle. The wings of the bird, a living splendor, were outspread as if for flight, and it carried still in its steely claws the rare circlet of the crown. Librating, it hung for a little over the throne, while the king watched it in wordless awe and consternation. Then, with metallic whirring, its white tail deployed like the beams of a flying sun, it flew swiftly through the open portals and passed seaward from Aramoem into the morning light. After it, with great bounds and goatish leapings, the necromancer followed. And no man tried to deter him, but those who saw him depart from the city swore that he went north along the ocean strand, while the bird flew directly eastward, as if homing to the half-fabulous isle of its nativity. Thereafter, as if he had gone at a single bound into alien realms, the necromancer was not seen in Usthaim, but the crew of a merchant galley from Sotar, landing later in Aramoem, told how the gazolba bird had passed over them in mid-main, a several-colored glory still flying toward the sources of the dayspring, and they said that the crown of changeable gold with its 13 fellowless gems was still carried by the bird. And though they had trafficked long in the archipelagos of wonder, and had seen many prodigies, they deemed this thing a most rare and unexampled portent. King Euvoran, so strangely reft of that avian headgear, with his baldness rudely bared to the gaze of thieves and vagrants in the hall of justice, was as one on whom the gods have sent down a sudden bolt. If the sun had turned black in heaven, or his palace walls had crumbled about him, his dumbfoundment would hardly have been more excessive. For it seemed to him that his royalty had flown with that crown, which was the emblem and the talisman of his fathers. And moreover, the thing was wholly against nature, and the laws of God and man were annulled thereby, since never before in all history or fable had a dead bird taken flight from the kingdom of Usthaim. Indeed, the loss was a dire calamity, and Euvoran, having donned a voluminous turban of purple samite, held counsel with the sagest ministers regarding the state dilemma that had thus arisen. The ministers were no less troubled and perplexed than the king, for the bird and the circlet were both irreplaceable. And in the meanwhile, the rumour of this misfortune was borne abroad through Ustaim, and the land became filled with lamentable doubt and confusion, and some of the people began to murmur covertly against Eovaran, saying that no man could be rightful ruler of that country without the Gazolba crown. Then, as was the custom of the kings in a time of national exigence, Eovaran repaired to the temple in which dwelt the god Gaol, who was a terrestrial god and the chief deity of Erimoem. Alone, with bare head and unshod feet, as was ordained by hierarchical law, he entered the dim adytum, where the image of Gaol, pot-bellied and wrought of earth-brown faience, reclined eternally on its back, and regarded the motes in a narrow beam of sunlight from the slotted wall. And falling prone in the dust that had gathered around the idol through ages, the king gave homage to Gaol, and implored an oracle to illuminate and guide him in his need. And after an interim, a voice issued from the god's navel, as if a subterranean rumbling had become articulate. And the voice said to King Eovaran, "Go forth and seek the Gazolba in those isles that lie beneath the orient sun. There, O king, on the far coasts of dawn, thou shalt again behold the living bird, which is the symbol and the fortune of thy dynasty, and there, with thine own hand, thou shalt slay the bird." Euvoran was much comforted by this oracle, since the utterances of the god were deemed infallible, and it seemed to him that the oracle implied in plain terms that he should recover the lost crown of Ustaim, which had been the reanimated bird for its superstructure. So, returning to the royal palace, he sent for the captains of his proudest argosies of war, which lay then at anchor in the tranquil harbour of Erimoem, and ordered them to make immediate provision for a long voyage into the east and among the archipelagos of morning. When all was made ready, King Euvoran went aboard the flagship of the fleet, which was a towering quadrireme with oars of beefwood and sails of stout woven byssus dyed in yellowish scarlet, and a long gonfalon at the masthead, bearing the Gazolba bird in its natural colours on a field of heavenly cobalt. The rowers and sailors of the quadrireme were mighty negroes from the north, and the soldiers who manned it were fierce mercenaries from Xylac in the west. And with him, going aboard, the king took certain of his concubines and jesters and other ministrants, as well as an ample store of liquors and rare viands, so that he should lack for nothing during the voyage. And, mindful of the prophecy of Gaol, the king armed himself with a longbow and a quiver filled with parrot-feathered arrows, and he also carried a sling of lion leather and a blowgun of black bamboo, from which tiny poisoned darts were discharged. It seemed that the gods favoured the voyage, for a wind blew strongly from the west on the morning of the departure, and the fleet, which numbered 15 vessels, was borne with bellying sails toward the sea-risen sun. And the farewell clamours and shoutings of Eovaran's people on the wharves were soon stilled by distance, and the marble houses of Erimoem on its 4 palmy hills, here drowned in that swiftly foundering bank of azure which was the shoreline of Ustaim. And thereafter, for many days, the ironwood beaks of the galleys clove a softly weltering sea of indigo that rose unbroken on all sides to a cloudless dark blue heaven. Trusting in the oracle of Gaol, that earthen god who had never failed his fathers, the king made merry, as was his wont, and reclining beneath a saffron canopy on the poop of the quadrireme, he swilled from an emerald beaker the wines and brandies that had lain in his palace vaults, storing the warmth of elder ardent suns whereon oblivion's black rime was fallen. And he laughed at the ribaldries of his fools, at unquenchable ancient bawdries that had won the laughter of other kings in the sea-lost continents of yore. And his women diverted him with harlotries that were older than Rome or Atlantis, and ever he kept at hand beside his couch the weapons wherewith he hoped to hunt and slay again the Gazolba bird, according to the oracle of Gaol. The winds were unfailing and auspicious, and the fleet sped onward, the great black oarsmen singing gaily at their oars, and the gorgeous sailcloths flapping loudly, and the long banners floating on the air like straight-blown flames. After a fortnight they came to Sotar, whose low-lying coasts of Cassia and Sago barred the sea for 100 leagues from north to south, and in Loath, the chief port, they paused to inquire for the Gazolba bird. There were rumors that the bird had passed above Sotar, and some of the people said that a cunning sorcerer of that isle, named Iphibos, had drawn it down through his sorcery and had closed it in a cage of sandalwood. So the king landed in Loath, deeming his quest perhaps already nigh to its end, and went with certain of his captains and soldiers to visit Iphibos, who dwelt in a retired vale among the mountains at the island's core. It was a tedious journey, and Euvoran was much annoyed by the huge and vicious gnats of Sotar, which were no respecters of royalty, and were always insinuating themselves under his turban. And when, after some delay and divagation in the deep jungle, he came to the house of Iphibos on a high precarious crag, he found that the bird was merely one of the bright-plumaged vultures peculiar to the region, which Iphibo had tamed for his own amusement. So the king returned to Loath, after declining somewhat rudely the invitation of the sorcerer, who wished to show him the unusual feats of falconry to which he had trained the vulture. And in Loath the king tarried no longer than was needful for the laying aboard of 50 jars of the sovereign arrack, in which Sotar excels all other lands. Then, coasting the southern cliffs and promontories, where the sea bellowed prodigiously in mile-deep caverns, the ships of Euvoran sailed beyond Sotar and Tosk, whose people were more akin to apes and lemurs than to men, and Euvoran asked the people for news of the Gazolba, and received only a chattering as of apes in answer. So the king ordered his men-at-arms to catch a number of these savage islanders and crucify them on the cocoa palms for their incivility. And the men-at-arms pursued the nimble people of Tosk for a full day among the trees and boulders in which the island abounded, but without catching a single one of them. So the king contented himself by crucifying several of the men-at-arms for their failure to obey him, and sailed on to the 7 atolls of Umatot, whose inhabitants were mostly cannibals. And beyond Umatot, which was the usual limit of eastern voyaging from Ostean, the vessels entered the Ilosian Sea, and began to touch at partly mythic shores and islands charted only in story. It were tedious to relate the full particulars of that voyage, in which Eovaran and his captains went ever toward the sources of the dawn. Various and without number were the strange marvels they found in the archipelagos beyond Umatot, but nowhere could they find a single feather such as had formed part of the Gazolba's plumage, and the quaint people of those isles had never seen the bird. Howbeit, the king beheld many a flock of unknown fiery-winged fowl that went over the galleys in mid-sea, passing between the unmarked islets, and landing often, he practised his archery on lorikeets and lyrebirds and boobies, or stalked the golden cockatoos with his blowgun. And he chased the dodo and dinornis on shores that were otherwise unpeopled. And once, in a sea of high-beetling barren rocks, the fleet was assailed by mighty griffins that flew down from their crag-built eyries, with wings shining like feathery brass under the meridian sun, and making a harsh clangor as of shields shaken in battle. And the griffins, being both ferocious and pertinacious, were driven away with much difficulty by boulders hurled from the catapults of the vessels. Everywhere, as the ships drove eastward, there were multitudes of fowl, but at the sunset of a day on the 4th moon following their departure from Aramoam, the vessels approached a nameless isle that towered mile high with cliffs of black, naked basalt, around whose base the sea cried with baffled anger, and about whose precipices were no wings, nor voices of birds. The isle was topped with gnarly cypresses that might have grown in a windy graveyard, and sullenly it took the afterglow as if drenched with a gore of darkening blood. Far up in the cliffs there were strange columned eaves, like the dwellings of forgotten troglodytes, but seemingly inaccessible to men, and the caves, to all appearances, were unoccupied by any kind of life, though pitting the face of the isle for leagues. And Euvoran ordered his captains to drop anchor, meaning to search for a landing place on the morrow, since in his anxiety to retrieve the Gazolba he would pass no isle of the Dawnward Main, not even the unlikeliest, without due inquiry and examination. Quickly fell the darkness, without moon, till the close-anchored ships were visible to each other only by their lanterns, and Euvoran sat at supper in his cabin, sipping the golden arrack of Sotar between mouthfuls of mango jelly and phenicopter's meat, and saving a small watch on each of the vessels, the sailors and men-at-arms were all at evening mess, and the rowers ate their figs and lentils in the ore-deck. Then, from the watches, there was a wild shouting of alarm, and the shouting ceased in a moment, and each of the vessels rocked and sagged in the water as if a monstrous weight had settled upon it. No man knew the thing that had happened, but everywhere there was turmoil and confusion, some saying that the fleet was attacked by pirates. Those who peered from the ports and oar-holes saw that the lanterns of their neighbors had been quenched, and perceived a milling and seething as of low-driven clouds in the darkness, and saw that foul black creatures, large as men and winged like ouphirs, were clinging to the ranged oars in myriads, and those who dared to approach the open hatches found that the decks, the riggings, and the masts were crowded with similar creatures, who, it seemed, were of nocturnal habit, and had come down in the manner of bats from their caves in the island. Then, like things of nightmare, the monsters began to invade the hatches and assail the ports, clawing with hellish talons at the men who opposed them. And being somewhat hampered by their wings, they were driven back with spears and arrows, but returned again and again in thickening press without number, cheeping with a faint and bat-like sound. It was plain that they were vampires, for whenever they had dragged a man down, as many of them as could gain a mouthful would fasten on him incontinently and suck his blood till little more remained than a skin full of bones. The upper ore-decks, being half open to the sky, were quickly usurped, and their crews overcome with a hideous swarming, and the rowers in the orlops cried that the sea-water was pouring in through the oar-holes as the ship sank deeper beneath an ever-gathering weight. All night, at the ports and hatches, the men of Euvoran fought the vampires, taking turns in shifts when they wearied. Many of them were seized and their blood sucked before the eyes of their fellows as the night wore on. And the vampires, it seemed, were not to be slain by mortal weapons, though the blood they had gorged came forth in spouting rills from their wounded bodies, and thicklier they clustered upon the fleet, till the biremes began to founder, and the rowers were drowned in the sunken lower decks of certain triremes and quadriremes. King Euvoran was wroth at this unseemly turmoil that had interrupted his supper, and when the golden arrack was spilt, and the dishes of rare meat were emptied on the floor by the vessel's violent rocking, he would have issued from his cabin fully armed to try conclusions with these piacular miscreants. But even as he turned to fling wide the cabin door, there was a soft infernal pittering at the portholes behind him. And the women who were with him began to shriek, and the fools cried out in terror, and the king saw in the lamplight a grisly face with the teeth and nostrils of a flittermouse that leaned in through one of the cabin ports. He sought to repel the face, and thereafter till dawn he fought the vampires with those very weapons he had designed for the slaying of the Gazolba, and the ship's captain, who was with him at supper, guarded a second port with his claymore, and the others were held by two of the king's eunuchs, armed with scimitars. In this warfare they were favoured by the smallness of the ports, which could hardly in any case have allowed the free passage of their winged assailants, and after lightless hours of tedious, horrid struggle, the darkness became thinned with brown twilight, and the vampires lifted from the vessels in a black cloud and returned to their caves in the mile-high cliffs of that unnamed island. Heavy was the heart of Euvoran within him when he surveyed the damage done to his proud argosies of war, for among the 15 vessels 7 had sunk in the night, borne under and swamped by those obscenely clinging hordes of ouphirs. and the decks of the others were bloody as abattoirs, and half the sailors and rowers and men-at-arms were lying flat and flaccid as empty wineskins after the greedy drinking of the great bats. And the sails and banners were shredded into rags, and everywhere, from beak to rudder of Euvoran's galleys, there was the stain and reek of a Stymphalian foulness. So lest another eve should find them within wing-shot of that accursed isle, the king ordered his remaining captains to weigh anchor, and the other ships, with sea-water still awash in their oarlops, and some with drowned rowers still at the oars of their nether banks, drew slowly and heavily to eastward, till the pitted walls of the isle began to sink beneath the main. At eve there was no land in sight anywhere, and after 2 days, still unharried by the vampires, they came to a coral island, low in the wave, with a calm lagoon that was haunted only by ocean fowl, and there, for the first time, Euvoran paused to repair his tattered sails, and pump the sea from his holds, and clean the blood and vileness from his decks. However, in spite of this disaster, the king abated not in any degree his purpose to sail ever on toward the fountains of the day, until, as Gael had predicted, he should come again on the flown Gazolba and slay it with his own royal hand. So for another moon they passed amid other and stranger archipelagos, and penetrated deeplier into the regions of myth and story. Bravely they drove into mornings of amaranth crossed by gilded lories, and noontides of darkly ardent sapphire, where the rose flamingos went before them to lost inviolate strands. The stars changed above them, and under the alien-figured signs they heard the wild melancholy crying of swans that flew southward, fleeing the winter of realms indiscoverable, and seeking the summer in trackless worlds. And they held speech with fabulous men who wore for mantles the ell-wide pennants of the rock, trailing far on the earth behind them, and men who arrayed themselves in apiornis plumes. And they spoke also with antic people whose bodies were covered with a down like that of a new-hatched fowl, and others whose flesh was studded as if with pin-feathers. But nowhere could they learn aught of the Gazolba. At mid-forenoon, early in the 6th month of the voyage, a new and unheard-of shore ascended from the deep, curving for many miles, from northeast to southwest, with sheltered harbors and cliffs and pinnacled crags that were interspaced with low-lying verdurous dales. As the galleys hove toward it, Euvoran and his captains saw that towers were builded on certain of the highmost crags, but in the haven below them there were no ships at anchor, nor boats moving, and the shore of the haven was a wilderness of green trees and grass. And sailing still nearer, and entering the harbor, they descried no evident sign of man, other than the crag-reared towers. The place, however, was full of an extraordinary number and variety of birds, ranging in size from little tits and passerines to creatures of greater wing spread than eagle or condor. They circled the ships in coveys and great motley flocks, seeming to be both curious and wary, and Euvoran saw that a winged concourse, as it were, went to and fro above the woods and about the cliffs and towers. He bethought him that here was a likely haunt in which to track down the Gazolba. So, arming himself for the chase, he went ashore in a small boat with several of his men. The birds, even the largest, were patently timid and inoffensive, for when the king landed on the beach, the very trees appeared to take flight, so numerous were the fowl that soared and flew inland, or sought the crags and pinnacles that rose beyond bowshot. None remained of the multitude visible shortly before, and Euvoran marvelled at such cunning, and moreover he was somewhat exasperated, for he wished not to depart without bringing down a trophy of his skill, even though he should fail to find the Gazolba itself. And he deemed the behavior of the birds all the more curious because of the island's solitude, for here there were no paths other than would be made by forest animals, and the woods and meadows were wholly wild and incult, and the towers were seemingly desolate, with seafowl and landfowl flying in and out of their empty windows. The king and his men combed the deserted woods along the shore and came to a steep slope of bushes and dwarf cedars, whose upper incline approached the tallest tower at one side. Here, at the slope's bottom, Euvoran saw a small owl that slept in one of the cedars, as if wholly unaware of the commotion made by the other birds in their flight. And Euvoran trained an arrow and shot down the owl, though ordinarily he would have spared a prey so paltry. He was about to pick up the fallen owl when one of the men who accompanied him cried out as if in alarm. Then, turning his head as he stooped beneath the foliage of the cedar, the king beheld a brace of colossal birds, larger than any he had yet descried on that isle, who came down from the tower like falling thunderbolts. Before he could fit another arrow to the string, they were upon him with the drumming of their mighty vans, and beating him instantly to the ground, so that he was aware of them only as a storm of dreadfully rushing plumes and a hurly-burly of cruel beaks and talons. And before his men could rally to assist him, one of the birds fastened its huge claws in the shoulder cape of the king's mantle, not sparing the flesh beneath in its fell clutch, and carried him away to the tower on the crag, as easily as a gerfalcon would have carried a small leveret. The king was wholly helpless, and he had dropped his longbow beneath the onset of the birds, and his blowgun had been shaken loose from the girdle at which it depended, and all his darts and arrows were spilled, and he had no weapons remaining, other than a sharp misericordia, and this he could not use to any purpose against his captor in mid-air. Swiftly he neared the tower, with a flock of lesser fowl circling about him and shrieking as if with derision, till he was deafened by their din. And a sickness came upon him because of the height to which he had been carried and the violence of his ascent, and giddily he saw the walls of the tower sink past him with wide and portal-like windows. Then, as he began to retch in his sickness, he was borne in through one of the windows and was dropped rudely on the floor of a high and spacious chamber. He sprawled at full length on his face and lay vomiting for a while, heedless of his surroundings. Then, recovering somewhat, he raised himself to a sitting position and beheld before him, above a sort of dais, an enormous perch of red gold and yellow ivory, wrought in the form of a new crescent arching upward. The perch was supported between posts of black jasper, flecked as if with blood, and upon it there sat a most gigantic and uncommon bird, eyeing Euvoran with a grim and dreadful and austere mien, as an emperor might eye the gutter scum that his guards have haled before him for some obscene offence. The plumage of the bird was Tyrian purple, and his beak was like a mighty pickaxe of pale bronze that darkened greenly toward the point, and he clutched the perch with iron talons that were longer than the mailed fingers of a warrior. His head was adorned with quills of turquoise blue and amber yellow, like many a pointed crown, and about his long unfeathered throat, rough as the scaled skin of a dragon, he wore a singular necklace, composed of human heads, and the heads of various ferine beasts, such as the weasel, the wild cat, the stoat, and the fox, all of which had been reduced to a common size and were no longer than ground nuts. Euvoran was terrified by the aspect of this fowl, and his alarm was not lessened when he saw that many other birds of a size inferior only to his were sitting about the chamber on less costly and less elevated perches, even as grandees of the realm might sit in the presence of their sovereign. And behind Euvoran, like guards, there stood together with its fellow the creatures that had wrapped him to the tower. Now, adding to his other confounding, the great Tyrian feathered bird addressed him in human speech, and the bird said to him in a harsh but magniloquent and majestic voice, "Too hardily, O filth of mankind, thou hast intruded upon the peace of Orneva, isle that is sacred to the birds, and wantonly thou hast slain one of my subjects. For know that I am the monarch of all birds that fly, walk, wade, or swim on this terraqueous globe of earth, and in Orneva is my seat and my capital. Verily justice shall be done upon thee for thy crime. But if thou hast aught to say in thy defence, I will give thee hearing now, For I would not that even the vilest of earthly vermin and the most pernicious should accuse me of iniquity or tyranny. Then, blustering somewhat, though sorely afraid at heart, Euvoran gave answer to the bird, and said, I came hither seeking the gazolba which adorned my crown in Usteum, and was feloniously reft from me together with the crown through the spell of a lawless necromancer. And know that I am Euvoran, king of Usteum, and I bow me to no bird, not even the mightiest of that species. Thereat, the ruler of the birds, as if amazed and more indignant than before, made questions of Euvoran and interrogated him sharply concerning the gazolba. And learning that this bird had been slain by sailors and afterwards stuffed, and that the whole purpose of Euvoran in his voyage was to catch and kill it a second time, and re-stuff it if necessary, the ruler cried in a great and wrathful voice, This helpeth not thy case, but showeth thee guilty of a twofold and a triple infamy, for thou hast owned a most abominable thing, and one that subverteth nature. In this my tower, as is right and proper, I keep the bodies of men that my taxidermists have stuffed for me, but truly it is not allowable nor sufferable that man should do thus to birds. So for the sake of justice and retribution, I shall presently commit thee to one of my taxidermists. Indeed, methinks that a stuffed king, since even the vermin have kings, will serve to enhance my collection. After that, he addressed Euvoran's guards and enjoined them, Away with this violence. Away with this vileness. Confine it to the man-cage and maintain a strict watch before it. Euvoran, urged and directed by the pecking of his guards, was compelled to climb a sort of sloping ladder with broad rungs of teak that led from the chamber to one above it, in the tower's top. In the center of this room there was a bamboo cage of capacity more than ample for the housing of 6 men. The king was driven into the cage, and the birds bolted the door upon him with their claws, which seemed to have the deftness of fingers. Thereafter, one of them remained by the cage, eyeing Euvoran vigilantly through the spaces of the bars, and the other flew away through a great window and did not return. The king sat down on a litter of straw, since the cage contained no better provision for his comfort. Despair was heavy upon him, and it seemed that his plight was both dreadful and ignominious. And sorely was he astonished that a bird should speak with human speech, insulting and reviling humankind. And he deemed it an equally monstrous thing that a bird should dwell in royal state, with servitors to do his will, and the pomp and power of a king. And pondering these unholy prodigies, Euvoran waited for his doom in the man-cage, and after a while, water and raw grain were brought to him in earthen vessels, but he could not eat the grain. And still later, as the day drew toward afternoon, he heard a shouting of men and a shrieking of birds below the tower, and above these noises anon there were clashings as of weapons and thuddings as of boulders loosened from the crag. So Euvoran knew that his sailors and soldiers, having seen him borne into captivity in the tower, were assailing the place in an effort to succor him. And the noises waxed, mounting to a most tremendous and atrocious din, and there were cries as of people mortally wounded, and a vengeful shrilling as of harpies in battle. Then presently the clamour ebbed away, and the shoutings grew faint, and Euvoran knew that his men had failed to take the tower, and hope waned within him, dying in a darker murk of despair. So the afternoon went over, declining seaward, and the sun touched Euvoran with its level beams through a western window, and coloured the bars of his cage with a mockery of gold. Presently the light flowed from the room, and after a while the twilight rose, weaving a tremulous phantom web of the pale air. And between the sunset and the darkness, a night guard came in to relieve the day-flying owl who warded the captive king. The newcomer was a nyctalops with glowing yellow eyes, and he stood taller than Euvoran himself, and was formed and feathered somewhat in the burly fashion of an owl, and he had the stout legs of a megapode. Euvoran was uncomfortably aware of the bird's eyes, which burned upon him with a brighter bale as the dusk deepened. Hardly could he sustain that ever vigilant scrutiny. But anon the moon rose, being but little past the full, and poured a spectral quicksilver into the room, and paled the eyes of the bird, and Eovaran conceived a desperate plan. His captors, deeming all his weapons lost, had neglected to remove from his girdle the misericordia, which was long and double-edged and needle-sharp at the tip, and stealthily he gripped the hilt of his misericordia under his mantle, and feigned a sudden illness, with groanings and tossings and convulsions that threw him against the bars. And even as he had schemed, the great Nyctalops came nearer, curious to learn what ailed the king, and stooping, he leaned his owl-like head between the bars above Euvoran. And the king, pretending a more violent convulsion, drew the misericordia from its sheath, and struck quickly at the outstretched throat of the bird. Shrewdly the thrust went home, piercing the deepest veins, and the squawking of the bird was choked by his own blood, and he fell, flapping noisily, so that Euvoran feared that all the occupants of the tower would be awakened by the sound. But it seemed that his fears were bootless, for none came to the chamber, and soon the flappings ceased, and the Nyctalops lay still in a great heap of ruffled feathers. Thereupon the king proceeded with his plan, and shot back the bolts of the wide-latticed bamboo door with small difficulty. Then, going to the head of the teak-wood ladder which ran to the room beneath, he looked down, and beheld the ruler of the birds asleep in the moonlight on his chryselephantine perch, with his terrible pickaxe beak under his wing. And Eovaran was afraid to descend into the chamber lest the ruler should awake and see him. And also it occurred to him that the lower stories of the tower might well be guarded by such fowl as the nocturnal creature he had slain. Again his despair returned upon him, but, being of a slightful and crafty bent, Eovaran bethought him of another scheme. With much labor, using the misericordia, he skinned the mighty Nyctalops, and cleaned the blood from its plumage as best he could. Then Euvoran wrapped himself in the skin, with the head of the Nyctalops rearing above his own head, and eye-holes in its burly throat through which he could look out amidst the feathers. And the skin fitted him well enough, because of his pigeon breast and his pot belly, and his spindle shanks were hidden behind the heavy shanks of the bird as he walked. Then, imitating the gait and carriage of this fowl, the king descended the ladder, treading cautiously to avoid a fall, and making little noise, lest the ruler of the birds should awaken and detect his imposture. And the ruler was all alone, and he slept without stirring while Euvoran reached the floor and crossed the chamber stealthily to another ladder, leading to the next room below. In this room there were many great birds asleep on perches, and the king was nigh to perishing with terror as he passed among them. Some of the birds moved a little, and chirped drowsily as if aware of his presence, but none challenged him. And he went down into a third room, and was startled to see therein the standing figures of many men, some in the garb of sailors, and others clad like merchants, others nude and ruddled with bright oars like savages. And the men were still and stark as if enchanted, and the king feared them little less than he had feared the birds. But remembering that which the ruler had told him, he divined that these were persons who had been captured even as he himself, and had been slain by the birds, and preserved through the art of an avian taxidermy. And trembling, he passed down to another room, which was full of stuffed cats and tigers and serpents and various other enemies of bird kind. And the room below this was the ground story of the tower, and its windows and its portals by several gigantic night fowls, similar to that whose skin was worn by the king. Here, indeed, was his greatest peril, and the supreme trial of his courage, for the birds eyed him alertly with their fiery golden orbs, and they greeted him with a soft hoo-hooing as of owls, and the knees of Euvoran knocked together behind the bird shanks, but imitating the sound in reply, he passed among the guards, and was not molested by them. And reaching an open portal of the tower, he saw the moonlight rock of the crag lying at a distance of no more than 2 cubits below him. And he hopped from the door-sill in the manner of a fowl, and found his way precariously from ledge to ledge along the crag, till he reached the upper beginning of that declivity at whose bottom he had slain the little owl. Here his descent was easier, and he came anon to the woods around the harbour. But ere he could enter the woods, there was a shrill singing of arrows about him, and the king was wounded slightly by one of the arrows, and he roared out in anger and dropped the mantling bird-skin. Thereby, no doubt, he was saved from death at the hands of his own men, who were coming through the woods with intent to assail the tower at night. And learning this, the king forgave the jeopardy in which their arrows had placed him, but he thought it best to refrain from attacking the tower and to quit the isle with all dispatch. So, returning to his flagship, he ordered all his captains to set sail immediately, for, knowing the baleful power of the bird monarch, he was more than apprehensive of pursuit, and he deemed it well to place a wide interval of sea between his vessels and that isle ere dawn. So the galleys drew from the tranquil harbour, and rounding a northeastern promontory, they went due east in a course contrary to the moon. And Euvoran, sitting in his cabin, regaled himself with a variety of and plenitude of viands to make up for his fasting in the man-cage, and he drank a whole gallon of palm wine, and added thereto a jarful of the puissant pale gold arrack of Sotar. Halfway betwixt midnight and morn, when the isle of Ornevo was left far behind, the steersman of the vessels beheld a wall of ebon cloud that rose swiftly athwart the heavens, spreading and toppling in towers of thunder, till the storm overtook Euvoran's fleet and drove it on as if with the loosed hurricanes of hell through a welter of unstarred chaos. The ships were sundered in the gloom and were borne far apart, and at daybreak the king's quadrireme was alone in a prone-rushing tumult of mingled wave and cloud, and the mast was shattered along with most of the beefwood oars, and the vessel was a toy to the demons of the tempest. For 3 days and nights, with no glimmer of sun or star discerned through the ever-boiling murk, the vessels hurled onward as if caught in a cataract of elements pouring to some bottomless gulf beyond the fringes of the world. And early on the 4th day, the clouds were somewhat riven, but a wind still blew like the breath of perdition. Then, lifting darkly through the spray and vapour, a half-seen land arose before the prow, and the helmsman and the rowers were wholly helpless to turn the doomed ship from its course. And shortly after, with a great crashing of its carven beak and a terrible rending of timbers, the vessel struck on a low reef hidden by the flying foam, and its lower decks were flooded quickly, and the vessel began to founder, with the poop tilting sharply and more sharply, and the water frothing at the lee bulwarks. Gaunt and cragged and austere was the shore beyond the reef, beheld only through the veils of the sea's foaming fury, and scant it seemed was the hope of reaching land. But ere the wrecked argosy had gone beneath him, Euvoran lashed himself with ropes of coir to an empty wine-barrel, and cast himself from the sloping deck. And those of his men who were not already drowned in the hold or swept overboard by the typhoon leapt after him into that high wallowing sea, some trusting only to their might as swimmers, and others clinging to casks or broken spars or planks, and most were drawn under in the seething maelstroms or were beaten to death on the rocks. And of all the ship's company, the king alone survived, and was cast ashore with the breath of life unquenched within him by the bitter sea. Half drowned and senseless, he lay where the surf had spewed him on a shelving beach. Soon the gale forgot its violence, and the billows came in with falling crests, and the clouds went over in a rack of pearl, and the sun, climbing above the rocks, shone down upon Euvoran from a deep, immaculate azure. And the king, still dazed from the buffeting rudeness of the sea, heard dimly, and as if in a dream, the shrilling of an unknown bird. Then, opening his eyes, he beheld betwixt himself and the sun, librating on spread wings, that various-coloured glory of plumes and feathers which he knew as the gazolba, crying again with a voice that was harsh and shrill as that of the peafowl, The bird hung above him for a moment and then flew inland through a rift among the crags. Forgetful of all his hardships and the loss of his proud galleys of war, the king unbound himself in haste from the empty barrel, and rising giddily, he followed the bird. And though he was now weaponless, it seemed to him that the fulfillment of the oracle of Gaol was at hand, and hopefully he armed himself with a great cudgel of driftwood, and gathered heavy pebbles from the beach as he pursued the Gazolba. Beyond the cleft in the high and rugged crags he found a sheltered valley with quiet flowing springs, and woods of exotic leaf and fragrant orient shrubs in blossom. Here from bough to bough before his astounded eyes there darted great numbers of fowl that wore the gaudy plumage of the Gazolba, and among them he was unable to distinguish the one he had followed, deeming it the avian garniture of his lost crown. The multitude of these birds was a thing beyond his comprehension, since he and all his people had thought the stuffed fowl unique and fellowless throughout the world, even as the other components of the crown of Ousteam. And it came to him that his fathers had been deceived by the mariners who had slain the birds in a remote isle, swearing later that it was the last of its kind. However, though wrath and confusion were in his heart, Euvoran bethought him that a single bird from the flock would still stand as the emblem and the talisman of his royalty in Ousteam, and would vindicate his quest among the Isles of Dawn. So with a valiant hurling of sticks and stones, he tried to bring down one of the Gazolbas. And ever before him as he chased them, the birds flew from tree to tree with a horrid shrieking and a flurry of plumes that wrought an imperial splendor on the air. And at length, by his own good aim or the cast of chance, Euvoran slew him a Gazolba. As he went to retrieve the fallen bird, he saw a man in tattered raiment of an uncouth cut, armed with a rude bow, and carrying over his shoulder a brace of Gazolbas, tied together at the feet with tough grass. And the man wore in lieu of other headgear the skin and feathers of the same fowl. He came toward Euvoran, shouting indistinctly through his matted beard, and the king beheld him with surprise and anger, and cried loudly, "Vile serf! How darest thou to kill the bird that is sacred to the kings of Ousteim? And knowest thou not that only the kings may wear the bird for headgear? I, who am King Euvoran, shall hold thee to a dire accounting of these deeds." At this, eyeing Euvoran strangely, the man laughed, a long and derisive laugh, as if he deemed the king a person somewhat addled in his wits. And he seemed to find much merriment in the aspect of the king, whose garments were draggled and were stiff and stained with the drying sea-water, and whose turban had been snatched away by the felon waves, leaving his baldness without disguise. And when he had done laughing, the man said, "Verily, this is the first and only jest that I have heard in 9 years, and my laughter must be forgiven. For 9 years agone I was shipwrecked on this island, being a sea captain from the far southwestern land of Ulatroy, and the sole member of my ship's company that survived and came safe to shore. In all those years I've held speech with no other man, since the isle is remote from the maritime routes and has no people other than the birds. And as for your questions, they're readily answered. I kill these fowl to avert the pangs of famine, since there's little else on the isle for sustenance, apart from roots and berries. And I wear on my head the skin and feathers of the fowl, because my tarbouch was stolen by the sea, when as it flung me rudely upon this strand. And I wot not of the strange laws that you mention, and moreover your kingship is a matter that concerns me little, since the isle is kingless, and you and I are alone thereon. And I am the stronger of us twain, and the better armed. Therefore be well advised, O King Euvoran, and since you have slain yourself a bird, I counsel you to pick up the bird and come with me. Truly it may be that I can help you in the manner of spitting and broiling this fowl, for I must deem that you are more familiar with the products of the culinary art than with the practice." Now hearing all this, the wrath of Euvoran sank within him like a flame that fails for oil. Clearly he saw the plight to which his voyage had brought him in the end, and bitterly he discerned the irony that was hidden in the true oracle of Gaol, and he knew that the wreckage of his fleet of war was scattered among lost islands or blown into seas unvoyageable, and it came to him that never again should he see the marble houses of Aramoam, nor live in pleasant luxury, nor administer the dooms of law between the torturer and the executioner in the hall of justice, nor wear the Gazolba crown amid the plaudits of his people. So, not being utterly bereft of reason, he bowed him to his destiny, and he said to the sea captain, "There is sense in what you say, therefore lead on." Then, laden with the spoils of the chase, Euvoran and the captain, whose name was Naz Obamar, repaired companionably to a cave in the rocky hill slope of the island's interior, which Naz Obamar had chosen for his abode. Here the captain made a fire of dry cedar boughs, and showed the king the proper manner in which to pluck the fowl and broil it over the fire, turning it slowly on a spit of green camphor wood. And Euvoran, being famished, found the meat of the Gazolba far from unpalatable, though somewhat lean and strongly flavored. And after they had eaten, Nazobamar brought out from the cave a rough jar of the island clay, containing a wine he had made from certain berries, and he and Eoveran drank from the jar by turns, and told each other the tale of their adventures, and forgot for a while the rudeness and desolation of their plight. Thereafter they shared the isle of the Gazolbas, killing and eating the birds as their hunger ordained. Sometimes, for a great delicacy, they slew and ate some other fowl that was more rarely met on the isle, though common enough, perhaps in Usteam or Ulatroy. And King Eoran made him a headdress from the skin and plumes of the Gazolba, even as Naz Obamar had done. And this was the fashion of their days, till the end.